Welcome to Clocking Out, brought to you by Careerminds. I'm your host, Raymond Lee. I have to say, as I reflect back on that first podcast and interview with Steve, that was a tough one. Being vulnerable just isn't easy. I think I was sweating during that interview, but I wanted to be real with the listeners. I wanted to share the personal side of me, where I came from, and the struggles that I experienced along the way. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to episode 1, I'd encourage you to go back and check it out. The first podcast was, I would say, it's a precursor in the context to my clocking out, leaving home, and ultimately launching my first startup company. You'll also hear me getting interviewed by my fellow friend and podcaster, Steve Mellor, he's the founder and author of The Career Competitor. So here we go with the second part with Steve Mellor and my clocking out story. All right, welcome back. Here we are, Steve, part 2.
Part 2, baby. Here we go. Piggybacking off as we were rounding the corner of your early years and coming into life after being an employee and potentially becoming the employer. And where we left it, man, you had this spark, you had this fire starting to kick in, and you recognized that at the heart of that spark was this notion of being an entrepreneur. So why don't we just start there? You've been doing this for a long time now, but let's look back. Let's rewind to that moment before you owned anything.
Yeah.
What was the draw? What was the allure, the draw of actually becoming an entrepreneur?
Well, so first of all, my mom was, kind of reflecting back. She was an entrepreneur herself. She left being a school teacher and became a court reporter, and ended up being a court reporter for pretty much most of her life. And I talked about the fact that, she chose the career just because of the money that she was going to make as a result of it. But she ended up starting her own court reporting business. And so the fact of seeing her kind of take that risk, that leap of faith to go out on her own, really gave me the inspiration that, it's possible in terms of, and I use the clocking out, going from working in a corporate role to becoming an entrepreneur and going out on your own. And so it was, I ended up leaving Corning. I talked about how the company was going through massive layoffs, and we were doing all the outplacement work there, helping people find jobs that were essentially laid off from their jobs. And I ended up taking a severance package, and I ended up at a company called Faro Corporation, working and continuing in HR. And I did that for about 5 years. And it became clear to me that I was hitting a plateau. And, I think about what really gets me excited is seeing things, building things, and really seeing things grow. And I oftentimes got frustrated, because I'd want to build things within the role that I was working, but I'd always hit that, that speed bump where my boss would temper me and say, look, we can't do that. We can't make that investment. And so it got to a point where I said to myself, it's time to go out on my own. And throughout my entire career, I always found myself wanting to help people with their career. I was always giving career advice. And so, the idea of starting a new company had to align with something where I was helping people with their career in some capacity. And so I made the decision that I was going to go out on my own, and I was going to take the leap of faith. I actually went to my boss, and I said to my boss at the time, that I wanted to leave the company, and I wanted the company to support me in that effort, and allow me to hire my replacement, train my replacement, and then let me take them on as their first client. And they said yes to them all. I did a great job, and they loved the work that I do. And I think, quite frankly, Steve, they knew I was leaving. They knew I wasn't going to be sticking around, and so they said, sure. And so my boss completely, by the way, I have to tell you, he was not a happy camper. And he was,
even though they knew you probably weren't sticking around, he still wasn't happy about it.
Yeah. Well, my boss was, I generally never connect with friends on Facebook, and he's the only person that I'm friends with today on Facebook. And there's a lesson here that when you leave a company and you don't always have the best relationship with your boss. I mean, he was a great guy, but he and I butted heads. I always wanted to do things, and he would temper me and say, nope, we can't do that. And I got frustrated, and we get in these big arguments. And when I was leaving the company, I was like, in that exit interview, I was like, all right, I'm going to really give it to him. But I never did. I respected the fact that, he had a job to do. And while I was frustrated, I said to myself, I'm not going to go there. And there was a big lesson there because, I'm kind of fast forwarding it a bit, but
sure.
He ended up being my first significant account because he ended up leaving the company and ended up becoming head of HR for another company. And he reached out. He was our first significant account with the company. And so I ended up leaving and going out on my own. I hired my replacement. I worked as a contractor for this company while I was sort of figuring things out.
Yeah, the lesson learned. There's a big one right there. Is you can burn the boats in many ways, right? You can go out and just say, hey, if I never talk to you ever again, then I'm gonna impart you with all of these insights and feedback that you're probably not going to want to hear, but at what cost? And for you to kind of have that, whether it was conscious, subconscious intuition, just to sort of say like, okay, let's just answer the questions and be respectful. And to your point as well, just sort of identifying like, hey, at the end of the day, this guy has a title, he has a role, he has responsibilities, and he's doing his best. He's doing his best, and having a respect for that. And for you, something that you said here during that story is you were plateauing. And just from my sort of outside looking in at so many stories like this over the years, I feel as though we find ourselves in life with two responses in those moments when we plateau. Either we just kind of accept the plateau and eventually that plateau turns into some form of a regression, or the plateau creates a spark. It's like, I don't want to just kind of be on this treadmill. I don't want to just stay stationary while life just moves along. There's something more here, and I have to figure out what that more is. So you clearly were able to figure that more out. Here you were pitching the way you pitched on your way out to your former employer. How did you know, firstly, that this is what you wanted the business to be? And I'm also curious, how'd you come up with the name Careerminds? Like, it's just always interesting to me, like Careerminds is, and it obviously speaks so much to the work that you do now, but in its inception, why did all of that sort of make sense to you?
Yeah. Well, back in 1997 at my first job back in New Orleans, I knew I wanted to start a company. And there wasn't a GoDaddy at the time where you could go online and type in, a bunch of websites,
right,
URLs. And I called this 800 number, and I knew I needed a website. And this was 10 years before I actually launched the company. And I get on the phone with this, this rep on this 800 line. And I said, I want to get a website. And at first I went to career.com. That was already taken. I tried a couple of other kind of scenarios. And I sat back and I asked myself, what is looking for a career mean to someone? What exactly is that? And I ended up coming up with Careerminds primarily because, when I think back to my college education, I got my undergrad in psychology. I got my graduate degree in industrial organizational psychology. And I thought to myself, looking for a career is a state of mind. Like, it's a real intentional sort of effort that you put toward to identify what exactly is it that I want to do, not just today, but tomorrow, the next day, and the next day. It's more than a job. And so I thought of it as a state of mind. And I asked the person, is Careerminds available? careerminds.com. And they said, yes, it's available. And I bought it. That was in 1997. So it was 10 years before I launched the company. And yeah, when I walked into my boss's office and I said, I'm going to be launching a new company, and they said, what's the name of the company? And I said, Careerminds. I actually got goosebumps because it was sort of like, this is going to have to be a real thing, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, firstly, what a unique story. I mean, there's not many of those stories you're going to hear over the years where someone, it's like coming up with the title for a book, right? Before you've written a word and saying like, I'll write a book one day and I've got the best title you can possibly imagine. And people are like, where's the book? And I'm like, well, I've not started the book yet, but the title is phenomenal, you know? And so here you are 10 years before actually doing anything with it, coming up with this thing that not only you come up with the name of it, but then you find yourself 10 years later in a position where everything makes sense in your career at that time for this company and this name to be what you step into. Like it's exactly as you almost created it. You spoke it into existence, if you will. I mean, how were you able to recognize, I suppose, that the work that you'd been doing, it was leading you to the creation of what Careerminds became?
When I left Corning and doing the outplacement work, it wasn't like, at that time, I wasn't thinking about like that work was actually going to be the outcome of what I was going to be doing. Mm-hmm. When I left Ferro, which was the chemical company I worked at, we were in this big hiring mode and the company was hiring, growing. This was in around 2006, 2007. And my role at the time was recruiting. Like my focus was growing and hiring. And so when I launched the company, I initially launched it as a recruiting company, and it was geared toward helping people find jobs through recruiting. We did executive search. We were headhunters, contingent headhunters, and ended up launching as a recruiting company. And the company that I left, I went to my boss and said, I want to start recruiting for the company. And they said, yeah, sure. So we signed up a contract. And day one, I was off to filling jobs. I was filling engineering roles, IT, manufacturing, ended up hiring 2 recruiters who worked part-time and eventually became full-time. After about a year, ended up hiring a salesperson. So a year into it, I was feeling really good about myself. You know, I was like, Careerminds is well on its way to be this really thriving recruiting company. And then October of 2008 hit when Lehman Brothers announced their collapse, and the financial markets collapsed and Wall Street collapsed. And the phone started ringing that offers were being rescinded, requisitions for jobs were being canceled. And all of a sudden, I just saw all the work that I built up with this one account, plus some other accounts that we had gotten over the year for some recruiting, evaporated overnight.
Right.
And that was the first time that I actually said to myself, I think I'm going to head back to HR. I don't know that this is going to work out. And there was a company that I was doing some recruiting for at the time called Theater Extreme. And this company was putting theater home systems in residential housing. If you remember, in the housing boom of 2005 to 2007, everyone had a theater system in their home, and with the chairs and all that stuff. And we were helping them find salespeople across the country, sales manager for stores, and I got a call from one of their executives that said, we lost our funding. They were funded by Circuit City. We lost our funding and we're going to go bankrupt. We're filing Chapter 7 and we're going to end up having to lay everyone off. And he said, by the way, any chance that you can help these employees find jobs? And I thought to myself, it's like, bing, bing. And that was the pivot. that I had to make. And it was pretty crazy because, at the time I was thinking this is going to be a recruiting business. And then all of a sudden, overnight, it dissolves, goes away. And then, I see this opportunity to transform Careerminds and pivot into an outplacement company.
Yeah, it feels as though through that story, you gave Careerminds a complete definition. It was like at the beginning, the emphasis was very much on career. And then in that light bulb moment, it was almost as though this is how we get intentional. This is how we actually allow people's minds to feel assertive in the growth, in the pursuit of their career. Because again, outplacement at the time, I mean, you can obviously speak to this better than anybody. I have to assume there wasn't much of an industry for it in terms of the services that you were now considering offering, because it sounds as though this Bing moment was very much a Bing in the sense of, oh, this is a place that we can almost create an identity of our own because there's not a huge identity for this already established.
Well, so outplacement's has been around for 30, probably 50 years now.
Sure.
Very traditional, brick and mortar. And, when I got that question from that one executive that said, hey, can you help us? Can you help these executives and our employees who are impacted by this bankruptcy transition into jobs and help them find jobs, write their resumes and all that stuff? I thought to myself, absolutely. I thought back to my Corning days when I was helping all those employees that were laid off from Corning find jobs, but they were going into an office and they were meeting face to face with coaches and resume writers and accessing computers and fax machines. And, when you think about that today, you're probably like, those are the days that are gone. And I had the question that I had to ask myself is, how am I actually going to coach these people? It was sort of, it was a decision that it's like, are we going to compete against, the firms that have been around for, 50 years and have offices all over the country or all over the world? Are we going to start opening offices so we can meet face to face with these individuals? Or, what's going to be the mode of delivery? And so we ended up deciding, and when I say we, one of the executives from the company, when I saw his resume, he had a PhD in educational technology, ended up being employee number one. By the way, we had to lay off the recruiters, we had to lay off the salesperson, so it was back to just me.
Sure.
And this first person, his name is Justin Shackleman, who's a dear friend of mine today. He was employee number one and was really the start of building out a platform and a capability that became the virtual delivery model that we built. So our identity that you talk about here is really not necessarily about, establishing ourselves as like, just another outplacement company, but we really wanted to redefine what outplacement looked like in the space. And it was around leveraging and harnessing technology in a way that helps people not only accelerate their ability to re-enter the workforce, but allows coaches to come in and leverage technology in a way that makes their coaching more impactful. And so this was 2008 when, we were a time where we were, the world was in some cases virtual, but the desire for that in-person meeting was still very, strong. And for us, HR, I grew up in HR, so I think it's okay for me to say this. HR is not risk takers. They're, they're not ones to be the first early adopters when, there's a new shiny object, new technology. And so for us, it was going to be a long road to, disrupt the market that was just so traditional with this idea that you have to meet face to face with, someone.
Yeah. So what about that road was appealing to you? I mean, it doesn't sound, and some people hearing this would be like, that sounds like a road that I'm just going to stay the heck away from. That's a lot of work. That's probably a lot of adversity. But what about that road as you had the outlook towards the future? What about it was appealing?
Yeah, well, it was scary. I remember, when we launched CareerMinds as an outplacement company, I went to my first Sherm event, and I had to, we were sponsoring the event. And I knew in my mind that I had this great idea, and I think this idea was going to be transformative in terms of the impact. Mm-hmm. But I was like an HR person one day, and then the next day I got my business cards from Vistaprint, and all of a sudden I'm founder and CEO of CareerMinds, this new virtual outplacement company. And I have to be honest, it didn't roll off my tongue as easy as like the founder and CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, or Elon Musk. It's sort of like, I was growing into this role of CEO of this business that I was really excited about. And so, the shift from, HR to CEO was an evolution for me. There was a huge amount of insecurity early on that I had to get over. And so while I was super energized about this idea of being the leading provider of virtual outplacement solutions in a very fragmented market, was really scary. And so I was very excited, but also very nervous.
What part of you felt, that what I love about that story is I immediately, thinking back to the first episode of just how you evolved and how you grew, here you were in this moment where you were faced with this new title, CEO, founder. It was almost a way of putting your identity under the microscope again. Having, as an employee, you find your way, you figure out where your roles and influences and impact can be. But to say that your identity is under the microscope, I don't think is necessarily something that an employee would resonate with. You become the founder and CEO, and it's like, at that point, when you go all the way back to being the sole member of the company, it's like where Raymond Lee ends, CareerMinds begins, and vice versa. So talk us through some of that identity component, maybe how you handled it, but more so just reflecting as well on some of those journeys and proving doubters wrong as you go back to your childhood. Like, how much did those hurdles that you climbed and were able to get over through those years help you through that next chapter now of almost, again, this next evolution, if you will, of your identity?
I think of humility, when I think back of, early on, and I think about the impact that my parents, my mom had on me. I've always been a pretty humble person, in terms of how I show up in the world, and humble in a way that I'm open to learning. I don't have the answers. And, when I think about the early stages of the company, I realized that we were so early to the market that, in order for us to continue to grow, I was going to have to raise some venture capital or I was going to have to raise funding. I was either going to have to get a loan or was going to have to get some kind of funding in order to continue to grow. And we knew we had something good when we developed this technology platform. And, but we also realized that in order to continue to grow, we were going to have to raise some funding. And I had no experience in raising venture capital or going out and seeking funding. And I think there was many doses of me recognizing that, like, I just didn't have the answers, and having that humility where you just sort of like, you know what, I'm not going to pretend like I know everything, and just sort of be like, you know what, I'm going to have to figure it out. I'm going to put myself out there and know that I'm not going to have the answers, and we'll learn from my mistakes, the growth. And so I would say the humility is one of the key factors that I took from just early on as I kind of grew up and learned through life that really attributed to the success along the way.
I love that, because at the heart of that is your way of saying that even in some of those maybe potential insecurities that come with having CEO, having founder attached to your name, you were still able to keep Raymond at the center of it. You weren't allowing the role to sort of influence a lack of humility. You were actually looking at, if anything, you were saying, now that I'm in this position, I need to rely on what Raymond does best more than ever before. I need to be as true to myself more than ever before, and double down, if anything, on the humility by, hey, this is not a time for me to be proud and assume I can figure this out on my own. Like, why not ask for help? And tell us about some of the maybe initial growth and some of the success stories, let's say, that came from that asking for help. You were saying there, you were meeting with investors, you were doing things for the first times. What did some of those first initial, success moments look like?
Well, first of all, I realized early on that alone wasn't going to do it. And, putting the house up for, refinancing and establishing credit to fund the business wasn't going to work. So, through some networking, I came and met a potential investor who was interested in the business. And raising capital is incredibly tough in terms of finding investors that believe in the product that you're building. We pitched probably, I'd say, 75 investors over the course of 6 months. We had a pitch deck and, our product, and we did demos, and we found one investor in the state of Delaware who had a connection to someone who used to run one of the largest outplacement firms called Ray Management. There's one of the two large outplacement firms out there. And this one particular person was connected to an investor who used to work together. And when we pitched this one investor, he knew he had this friend who ran one of the largest outplacement companies. And he said, if you pitch this person, this guy, his name is Jack Gavin, by the way. He said, if he believes in your business, we'll write you a check. And it took 75 pitches for us to find that one investor where there was that one connection. And so we got our pitch deck together. He scheduled the meeting. We met this guy, Jack Gavin, who at the time didn't really know him. We go into Center City, Philadelphia. We schedule this meeting, go into this conference room. It's this long table, and I have my laptop and got the screen. I'm getting ready to do my demo. And I share this story because I think it's funny. You ever watch Elf, the movie Elf? Who doesn't watch Elf, right? You remember the scene when you go in a conference room and there's Miles Finch? Yeah. You remember Miles Finch?
Yeah.
And they're like, he's like, the Godfather of kids storytelling.
Right.
Well, I felt like that he was Miles Finch at the end of the table. And I was like pitching him this idea. Yeah. And I did the demo, and I showed the virtual platform and described sort of what this capability is going to look like. And he sat back in his chair and he folded his arms and he looked up and he said, this is exactly the kind of thing that I was afraid of 10 years when I was running Right Management. He said, luckily for me, we sold the company and I was able to get out before this actually surfaced. And I was, when I went into that meeting, I was like, this is a do or die. Everything was dependent on the outcome of what this one person, his vision of what he felt like was going to be the product of the future. And he leaned back, he said, this is incredibly impressive. He said, this is the future of this business. And he ended up becoming an investor. He gave the lead investor the thumbs up and he said, yes, this is the real deal. Very impressive. He ended up writing a check. The lead investor ended up writing a check. And then we ended up raising close to $3 million in a Series A round of funding. And he became the chairman of our board. And it was that moment. This was about 3 years after we launched. We launched in 2008. We closed the round of funding in May of 2011. So it was almost 3 years later. And it was at that moment, it took 3 years for me to sort of grow into this kind of like the CEO title of saying, okay, I'm ready. And the fact that someone from the industry who's worked in the industry for 15 years running one of the largest competitive firms, which we still are competitors today. I'm not a big fan of Right Management, but they're still out there. They're a good competitor. But he was willing to put his reputation on the line behind our business. And I felt like, that's what I needed as a CEO, to know that what I'm building, is something for the future.
I love it. I love it. And I think there's too many stories like this that don't get shared enough, because at the heart of that story, there's the 75 pitches that didn't work, but then there's this ability to recognize that, hey, it was about finding the right connection. It was about finding the person that was right for CareerMinds, and finding for CareerMinds the right person for, it. And just like that true connection where you could collaborate, and an investor could come in and say, listen, not only do we want to invest, but, everything about what you're doing, it's not about just profitability. It actually resonates with us. It's something we can recognize that this can be a gift to the future of what this industry is. And this was 2011. It's 2024 as we have this discussion. 13 years have passed since. And not to just, fast forward through all of that time, but I'm just curious, like, what have maybe been one or two moments, whether it be an adverse moment or whether it be a moment of success, that has just made this journey so worthwhile for you?
Yeah, it was a long road. We, we did get the funding in 2011, and here we are in 2024, and it's over a decade. And I would say, if anyone's thinking about raising venture capital out there, the one thing that I'll tell you is, once you take your first dollar, the clock starts ticking. And I didn't appreciate that at the time. When you're signing, it's like presenting in Shark Tank. When you take in that first, whether you're selling off 10% of your company, 50%, when you take in that first investment dollar, that investor is looking for a return, and the clock is starting to tick. And so that was in 2011. So over the course of 10 years, I'll tell you, it was steady growth. It took about 3.5 years for us to get to profitability, to where we really felt like we hit an inflection point of establishing enough market share, enough growth, where the investors felt like, their investment was going to pay off at some point. So I would say one of our first big successes was getting to profitability in around 2014, where we just didn't need additional funding. And so, that initial funding was enough for us to continue to grow. I would say that was the first big moment. And as we hit the 10-year mark, the pressures of exiting were just really building. It was in 2019 where, and I'll just kind of set the stage for you here, it was 3.5% unemployment. The economy in 2019, 10 years after the financial meltdown of 2008, 2009, which we were at a 10% unemployment rate, probably the worst time in quite a long time since COVID. But it was 2019. Things were great. We were seeing double-digit growth year over year. We had expanded globally into certain markets around the world. And the board meetings became almost a pressure cooker, where they would say, all right, so what's next? These are venture capitalists who, typically will exit an early stage fund anywhere between, let's say, 3 and 7 years. And so the pressure was really starting to build up around, what's the future for CareerMinds? And in some cases, we were the last company that were part of their fund, and they were looking to exit. And so that was in October of 2019, was our last board meeting that we had before March of 2020.
Right.
And it was incredible. That was the next moment that completely turned CareerMinds upside down in a positive way. Literally catapulted us to the next level. And never thought in a million years that it would take a global pandemic that would actually put CareerMinds on the map. So that was moment number 2.
Yeah. And You know, we've hit this point in this first and second episode where we've learned so much about you, the man behind the company, and then the story of the company. You know, as you look back on these kind of defining moments of, you know, not even just CareerMinds, but your entire career, you know, and you think about the HR professional you started out as, and then the entrepreneur that you became, and now having seen and been exposed to so many different ups and downs and unimaginable moments, you know, what maybe stands out for you as to why you've been able to guide the ship successfully this whole time? Because I think that's a really important message here for anybody to not only understand the success of CareerMinds, but understand why Raymond Lee has been successful in that process as well, because it's not always both. It's not always both. Some businesses come at the expense of the business owner and vice versa. So why is it that CareerMinds has not only been able to succeed the way it has, but what is it about Raymond Lee as well?
That's a great question. And I think character is a huge part of that. You know, when I think about my parents when I was young, and I think about the path that my mom took, the path that my dad took. I think that the character that I was able to establish at such a young age has grounded me to always being focused on working hard, making the right or trying to make the right decisions, right? Like I'm not always going to say that all the decisions are the right decisions, but if you go into a decision with the right intentions, then, you know, the outcome and the consequences from those decisions are always going to be positive in some degree, whether the decision ends up being something that you learn from or something that you grow from. I think having that character has always allowed me to be the person I am when I show up, whether it's with employees, whether it's with colleagues, clients. I think it's the character that I've been able to evolve over time. And it's like that core has allowed me to make the impact that I've made.
No doubt. And again, that's the beauty of something like character is it never goes out of style. It never goes out of style. You know, it's one of these things that will last all adversities and all successes. And there's no surprise that both you and CareerMinds have been the success story that they've been. Before we move on to episode 3, which I'm so excited to get to because it's going to highlight this incredible story that is your mother. Any final words just that you feel as though people need to know, not only about your story, whether it be CareerMinds as well, or maybe just some final insights just to kind of really wrap up these first 2 episodes?
Yeah. So, you know, the podcast is called Clocking Out. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's so many people who are currently in situations where they're not fulfilled in their job. Mm-hmm. I was just about a year ago, I listened to Andre Agassi's book, Open, his autobiography. And I know we're going to get to you. I know you're a big swimming fan, but tennis was my sport that I loved to follow. And Andre Agassi in the 80s was the tennis player that I absolutely loved. And I read his book or listened to his book a year ago. And it wasn't until a year ago that I realized that Andre absolutely despised the sport of tennis.
Wow.
He won 8 Grand Slams. Mm-hmm. He won a gold medal. In the 80s, was regarded as the best tennis player of all time. But he absolutely despised the sport. He was forced into the sport by his father. And he rebelled. I always wondered why he wore pink shorts to Wimbledon and wore long hair and dyed his hair. And he was rebelling. He gave his tennis rackets away to the homeless after one game. And so, you know, when I think about my life and the decisions that I've made, I would say that when you reflect on the career that you're in, if you're not being fulfilled, like genuinely fulfilled by the work, challenge yourself to do some insight around what would bring you fulfillment, and challenge yourself on, what would fulfillment look like for you? And then, think about clocking out and making a pivot and starting something new. And I think, Andre Agassi did that late in his career. He ended up retiring from tennis, and he became a philanthropist, and he started a fantastic nonprofit for underprivileged kids. But, when I think back, I hesitated about leaving my job as an HR professional because, I thought, I have a great career here. I'm a good HR person, and I see a pathway. But at the heart, I knew that there was this entrepreneurial spirit that I wanted to pursue, but I was scared. And I think a lot of people hold back on seeking that career fulfillment for a number of reasons. One is because they may have some insecurities that lead to, them not pursuing that dream. And, for me, when I was young, there were some things that happened to me that I had to deal with at a young age to sort of give me that confidence to make that leap of faith. And so I would, if you're a person who's really wanting to shock the world and, go out there and do something very different that's going to bring you fulfillment, I would say life is long, but life is also really short. And I would make the most of it. And I think this is a good segue to what's to come next.
I mean, you've just given us the teaser of all teasers, man. I mean, it's a great teaser to set us up for episode 3. And just as an added aside, you've also given the title of my book in 2 episodes. We're 2 for 2 now in the history of clocking out. Shock the World has been mentioned in both episodes. So we'll see how many more episodes we can keep that going for. But
yes,
Ray, I appreciate all of this, man. And I know all your listeners will too.
Great. Steve Mellor, thank you so much for such a great interview, such thought-provoking questions. You are truly a natural, my friend. And I'm incredibly grateful to your friendship and your support of the show. And thank you again to our sponsor, CareerMinds, a global provider of outplacement and leadership development services. You can learn more about CareerMinds at careerminds.com. And finally, if you'd like to connect with me to ask me a question, you can find me on LinkedIn, and I'm also on Instagram at raymondlee.co. Until next time, remember, if you're stuck or unsure of your future, and you think it's time for a change, I would encourage you to ask yourself these 3 questions. Does my work make me feel alive? Am I doing the things that matter to me most? And am I creating value for myself and others? Until next time.